Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. This is the third lecture of the third place lecture series, our fall lecture series. We will be continuing next spring in the next semester. Today we have Lindsay Bigham and Erik Herrmann. And to introduce them, I'm going to ask Connor Smith and Rachel Glanton to step in here. They, as you guys know, the lecture series this year is interlaced, connected with the new student journal, Inter, and as new co-editors, Connor and Rachel have been fully involved in all the lecture series, but specifically in Erika and Lindsay's coming here. So thank you, guys.
Need your face. Yeah, as David mentioned, just a brief reminder that the call for contributions for the journal, Inter, is November 22nd deadline, so right before Thanksgiving break. So if you have anything you haven't submitted, maybe you thought you missed the first deadline, please submit it before Thanksgiving break, before kind of things get crazy with final reviews. So without further ado, Outpost Office is a design practice based in Columbus, Ohio, where principals and co-founders, Ashley Bigham and Erik Herrmann, teach at the Knowlton School at Ohio State University. Outpost Office seeks new public audiences through experimental, creative production ranging from the serious to the absurd, often simultaneously. Inventive applications of off-the-shelf tools and industrial-grade materials often characterize the practice's work.
Their designs propose that architecture can be projective and impactful while at the same time inexpensive, temporal, and open-ended. Particular focuses of Outpost Office includes experimental platforms for gathering and speculations in and about the American suburbs. So this is one of the main reasons why we invited them for their focus on the American suburbs and how that relates to the third place. So we're very excited to have you, and without further ado, please welcome them to the lecture.
Thank you so much. That was really nice.
Okay, we're going to tag team this, so all right. Oh, of course. Okay, so thanks to everyone for joining this afternoon. Thank you to David for the hospitality and showing us around. It's a beautiful place. We're both originally from Tennessee, so it's nice little kind of homecoming here for us. Woo! To see this beautiful campus in a region that means a lot to us. As was mentioned, we now teach in the Midwest. And we're grateful to be part of the Third Place series alongside a lot of scholars and designers that we greatly admire. And our appreciation to Rachel and Connor of the forthcoming Inter. Everyone get your submissions in. It's always lovely to be invited by your colleagues and fellow educators, but it's a tremendous and gratifying honor to actually be invited by students. So thank you for taking notice of our work. So this afternoon we want to discuss architecture and its relationship to time in our practice. We consider ourselves experimental architecture collaboration, and you'll see in the lecture we use a lot of novel tools and techniques in these spatial endeavors, and these high-tech tools tend to suggest that we're experimental, but that doesn't really make us experimental. We experiment first and foremost with mindsets and with attitudes. So in her book, Timefulness, How Thinking Like a Geologist Can Help Save the World, Marcia Bunarud argues that we might think more like geologists to tackle planetary crisis like climate change. And her reasoning is simple and elegant. Geology as a discipline tackles head-on the enormous timescales of Earth's history. And to do so takes a certain measure of polytemporal expertise, an ability to examine time at radically different scales. This is one way of understanding time, and it's particular to geologists who deal with time at many scales, from sudden events to phenomena that are measured in millennia. So while architects are undoubtedly capable of working at various scales, we would offer that time scales is one of architecture's blind spots. The illusion of permanence is a hallowed paragon of Western architecture, reinforced by ideologies organized around so-called timeless qualities of building. And architects must celebrate, we celebrate timeless in architecture, the manufactured, the monumental, and the permanent. But our kind of immutable icons belie the inherent dynamism of a world experiencing accelerated change in climate, population shifts, and political instability. So the way we think about it is the world is changing faster than our design habits. We face urgent realities, often at odds or even incompatible with this notion of permanence. So we must ask when permanence is a necessity and when it's an ideological liability, ill-suited to ecological and social balance. And so to help consider this question, we're pursuing architecture that works with time rather than against it. What might it look like if architecture embraced multiple timescales while dismantling this illusion of permanence? So we're looking for an architecture that's not timeless, but timeful.
Outpost Office designs timeful installations, events, and buildings that change architecture's core tenets of permanence and accumulation by proposing provisional, open-ended, and contingent environments. Our drawing field series, for example, constructs temporal enclaves with a focus on performance and process over time, over permanence. Each installation utilizes a GPS-controlled robot to paint a site-specific building-sized drawing with temporary marking paint. This is the same paint that's used on children's sports fields, so it's non-toxic and biodegradable. So this work acknowledges the manifold and overlapping timescales of architecture. The painting takes only a few days, but the project disappears within a few weeks. In between, the setting is used for a cycle of several outdoor performances. In another painting project, we collaborated with students from Texas A&M School of Architecture to design and paint an enormous labyrinth on their central quad. The temporary landscape became a formalized informality, suggesting certain notations of occupying the landscape, but affording a myriad of possibilities. Buildings do not have an exclusive hold on the public imagination of permanence. Landscapes also do. This is why 2 days after this painting was complete, a fleet of grounds crew and lawnmowers were deployed to erase the pattern, simply because this is the way they understand landscape at Texas A&M and many places.
So we're also interested in slowing things down. So this is a drawing machine. It's part of a project we call Another Compomartio, which produces a literally slow drawing. The installation consists of a single dot matrix printer that's placed in a pedestal in the middle of a gallery. And it prints a continuous pattern until it exhausts a ream of dot matrix paper, which you can still get on Amazon, that makes up about 1,000 pages. The pattern is composed of digitized fragments from Piranesi's original Compomartio, but is randomly nested on demand, so no two performances are the same. And the resulting drawing is too large to look at all at once. It's overwhelming. And it's best experienced as it actually prints. But it's impossible to maintain your focus for the 8 hours it takes to exhaust the carton of paper. So as the drawing compulsively prints, the recognizable patterns of the slow drawing are completely obliterated into a field of noise. And while this drawing can be described or quantified by its ridiculous length, our focus has been considering the drawing as a kind of unit of time, both in their production and in their viewing. So how long is a drawing? And in our recent housing speculations that were acknowledged and we'll discuss in the lecture, our design thinking is more generational, considering the overlapping timelines of different family units to complement shifting dwelling habits, transitioning between work from home and childcare spaces to rental units and downsizing and place opportunities. We're looking not for a kind of functionalist flexibility, but we're pursuing affordance to change through an approach that blends bespoke moments with generic building fabric that can take on a lot of roles. These notions of tolerance, affordance, and allowance guide us in this work, and we'll talk about that more.
Timefulness begins with the very first mark. It's a mindset. For example, when working in the Chicago neighborhood of North Lawndale, we designed our installation process in a way that never closed this critical public space. The basketball court was an important community asset, and it was essential to allow people to still enjoy the court even during our week-long installation. So here in this video, a quick pickup game begins only moments after the completed painting of the court. So while the paint was actually still drying, but it dries in about 20 minutes, so it wasn't an issue. But this timeful approach allowed us to experience in real time how the space was used and discuss the impact with our work on the space with local residents as they were using a space. So the project is never really finished. And as we plan to discuss later, this project was understood as a bridge to an unknowable future. In another stack, this project, it functions literally and figuratively as the living room for an architecture school. It's a collection of lightweight foam platforms reconfigured and stacked daily as a terrace landscape for resting, relaxing, and studying. So there's no correct or incorrect way to organize the pieces, but there are moments of alignment that suggest certain correspondences and adjacencies. This project has a part-to-part methodology, so its individual parts won't add up to a whole like a puzzle, but instead they're a collective whole of misfits. They have irreconcilable differences. Not everything necessarily adds up to one singular form. So in other words, another stack doesn't have a correct arrangement, but it settles into a provisional organization through agonism and negotiation, something which is recurrent in many of our projects.
So today we're going to delve further into some of the select projects from the collaboration, and we're organizing them not by program, square footage, or completion date, but as you would expect, by duration. We'll begin with a project that lasted only a few weeks and close with work that reverberates for us with generational thinking. These are modest experiments, but they represent a shift in mindset we feel necessary to conduct ourselves as architects in the future. So we're going to begin with a project about marking and scoring time. In this project, we propose architecture as a series of drawings or paintings rather than a single installation. So this is from our series Drawing Fields. It was a temporary performance venue on the campus of Ragdale. So Ragdale is a nonprofit artist community located in Lake Forest, Illinois, just outside Chicago. So in early spring 2020, Ragdale canceled all its residencies and immediately limited site access to essential staff and ceased public programming. We all know why. And with the organization suddenly unable to open its grounds to the public, there were two related design challenges that emerged for its annual performance program. The first was, how would we be able to fabricate something on a restricted site? And the second was, how could you engage a radically distributed audience? So at Ragdale, we proposed, instead of doing one pavilion or one design, we would actually kind of have our own residency. We were quarantined on the campus, and we did a series of installations instead, learning a new tool and thinking really, again, carefully about what it meant to produce work on this campus at this time. So for the first project, Drawing Fields 1, we procured a drawing robot, which we'll talk about in more detail later, and used this as an opportunity to explore the robot's unique kinematics as it crisscrossed the field. So this is our, of course, powers of 10 illusion. And at this point, we really didn't know how to use the machine at all. These patterns were part of a unique dance duet between the robot and contemporary dancer Sarah Zalik. So Drawing Fields 2 was a temporary venue composed of nothing but brilliant white lines. The pattern is graphically intense, but kind of disarmingly vacant. It has an odd relationship to the site, which we'll talk about. So on the ground, this pattern became a kind of physically distant quilt for the audience. So there's zones of different sizes for families and groups of different scales that allow them to safely occupy the site. This was several months into the residency. And we also had to consider the distributed audience. A lot of people were viewing the campus simply through Zoom. So we produced a lot of footage and videos that we used to share the work. And then those got streamed into kind of parallel performances. So since they viewed the project from the vantage of the drone, the design of each pattern accounts for the unique perspectives possible for aerial photography. So we usually think of that view as kind of privileged, but in this case, it was the view almost everyone could access. And the vantage and the kinematics of the drone drove many of our compositional studies, which attempt to play with the optics of the drone's view, such as this seemingly recursive zoom. So it's designed to produce a kind of dynamism in the pattern. As you zoom in, the recursive pattern unfolds, and it depends on the movement of the robot. So you're designing something to be understood from the perspective of the drone, and its visual effects are driven by the movement that the drone uses. So the project bypasses the ecological precariousness of temporary architecture. There are no disposal costs or construction waste produced by this process. The 3 installations are water-soluble, non-toxic, and disappear with rain, sun, and growth. And in a few weeks, the site is ready for something new. So this work has continued in further installations, like this one in upstate New York at Art Oh My Sculpture Park. And this one, which we're happy to share, which is our most recent work, this is at Ohio State, situated on a small grove of trees. This is drawing field 7, which includes dynamic ribbons of yellow and lavender. So in this clip, you can see the drawing spans from the oval on the left, which is like our big kind of main quad space, or our iconic lawn. And then on the right is High Street, which is connected to downtown. So it becomes a way to kind of link the two spaces, actually in this grove, which is usually quite empty, actually. And the drawing opened on the first day of the semester, so it became a really fantastic way to kind of activate a space that the Wexner had difficulty getting people to enjoy. On the ground, the drawing provides a respite from the rigorous geometry of the Wexner Center, weaving vibrant threads of color to activate the grove with wefts and weaves. So there could be pathways, ribbons, implied topography. We left that up to the visitors to decide.
Yep, I'm going to shift just a minute. In parallel to all of this, this work that we've just shown from Outpost Office, for a decade now, we have been engaged in scholarship, teaching, and spatial advocacy in Ukraine, primarily focusing on material practices and cultural heritage. So I was a Fulbright Fellow in 2014 and spent a year as a fellow at the Center for Urban History in Lviv. Since then, I've maintained several significant partnerships with the professional and academic community in Ukraine, returning with American-based students to experience firsthand their architecture and culture on several occasions. These experiences are inseparable from our understanding of pedagogy and research and the way that they tie together. Working in Ukraine has offered us new conceptual frameworks, which are instrumental to translating our research, which is mostly based here in the US, into methods which work across various cultural contexts. So in 2019, Outpost Office was invited to work with the newly formed Kharkiv School of Architecture, which was Ukraine's first independent school of architecture. To celebrate their first year of their newly established bachelor's program, we led a seminar and worked with students to curate, design, and fabricate this exhibition titled Open Work. Our interpretation, our interpretation of this concept for open work, we wanted to ask the question, what makes an architecture school? So it's not only the work, but it's the social relationships, the physical ephemera, the material culture, and the architectural values of a place. As you can see here, one of our very first exercises we did just to learn about the school itself, we asked the students to kind of lay out and organize in this kind of knolling method all of the work that they had done for the previous semester, which we had not been a part of, but we were kind of these outside curators invited in to think about and contextualize their work differently. So our approach to the design of the exhibition draws from some research I've done on the organizational and material systems of open-air markets and bazaars. So as capitalism expands to new territories in post-Soviet contexts, shopping spaces are caught in the transformation of economic systems, giving formal characteristics to economic relationships. I'm continually fascinated with the architectural logics of organization, tectonics, and display methods which are found in Ukrainian markets. In a country often characterized by scarcity, these spaces have the unique ability to perform aesthetic acts of abundance. This project tested our own skills of bricolage, a term which was used by Claude Lévi-Strauss, which simply means to make do with the items you have at hand or the materials at hand. So we began procuring materials from Kharkiv's largest bazaar, Barabashova, and we worked our way into the circle of vendors who supply goods only to other market vendors, a kind of wholesale model. So the exhibition came with some interesting materials because of that process. So we only used this white metal grating, glossy white tiles, and generic LED lights. The metal grates are pretty ubiquitous in Ukrainian markets. However, they're often so fully covered with objects that they completely disappear into the background and you don't quite notice them. So here we wanted to really highlight them as designed objects as well. We designed these details also that really appeared to be complex through visual complexity, like these overlapping metal pieces, but they were actually very simple and they were completed with standard woodshop tools that the school had on hand. So the subtle X shape is perceptible in plan from the mezzanine above, and the lights help it appear as if it's hovering above this shiny floor. After designing this system of display, we asked the students to design new attachment details and to consider curatorial ideas of organization, and they were completely designing the organization and arrangement of objects. So the objects floating in the archive would produce micro-narratives that celebrated significant accomplishments of their first year of architecture school. So it included things like student work, but also their lecture posters or books, pillows, or hard hats. Also things that were important, like the woodworking tools, which once belonged to the shop manager's grandfather, so things that had been passed down for generations. Our goal here was to empower students and give them agency in their design education. So students gave tours of the exhibition where they could discuss books that had influenced them, things that they had made. This exhibition was also important because the school wanted to establish an image for the school to the general public in the city of Kharkiv. So their audience was not only the students, but it was really the general public. As Ukraine's first private school of architecture, the school is able to operate outside of state institutions, which can often get bogged down with bureaucracy or the inflexibility of outdated educational standards. However, their independent status also comes with other challenges, that being of a very small school in a city dominated by major universities. So our exhibition was the first opportunity for members of the public to experience the school, its role in shaping students, but also its desire to be and to provide important civic functions for public architectural education, to be that kind of third space, we could say, where debates and educational events could happen that were open and accessible to all members of the public. The exhibition design encouraged touching and handling and exploring objects, much like shopping in a bazaar does. The only connections were zip ties so that each element could be disassembled and reassembled later, be used for pinup boards or other pieces of infrastructure needed by the school. Because material circularity is part of the everyday aesthetics in Ukraine, it is a practical logistical solution, but it's also a deeply rooted cultural practice, and we wanted to sort of set that into the initial framework for the design. Long after we were gone, amazing things happened with it. So as architects, we might to some extent want to control, again, the duration of the construction, but the effects of architecture continue materially, socially, and culturally in different vestiges that we as architects can't control. So in the months following our installation, we were very excited to see that both the materials and the strategies from our workshop circulated throughout the school. So the mesh panels were used in many different configurations, here as rubbish bins for old models. But the notion of material circularity contributes to this kind of idea of timefulness in this project. And it also is not only in the material culture, but the pedagogical culture. So the processes that we began, like the knolling of projects at the end of each year, actually now continue to still happen every year at the school as they prepare for their final exhibition. So our work in Ukraine continues with increased resolve given the ongoing full-scale Russian invasion. And in addition to publications that are aimed to educate an American audience on Ukrainian architecture during war, next year I'm co-curating an exhibition that will be at the Center for Architecture in New York, which will highlight Ukrainian architects working in conflict zones, in case you're interested. We would also suggest that you follow the Kharkiv School on Instagram. They have a great Instagram page if you're just curious about what it is like to be a Ukrainian architecture student right now at this moment, but also before and beyond the war after. And so we want to just shout out to them, and this is how you can learn how to support.
So our next Timeful project is about public space for gathering, which was part of the previous Chicago Architecture Biennial, which just opened its 5th edition last weekend. So if you want to make your way to the Midwest, you can come join us for that. And this particular video that we'll start with is a kind of fitting representation of the biennial that we were really proud to participate in. It was organized by UIC faculty member David Brown, who served as a curator. And the biennial was called The Available City. And it reconsidered a network of city-owned lots as sites for new architectural speculation. One thing that's important to understand is that The Available City is an ongoing project of David Brown's that he's been working on for decades, which set the groundwork for performing this biennial. This is not something that could just be organized in 2 years, because the premise was, while past editions had taken all this work and shown it in the Cultural Center in downtown Chicago, this biennial Same thing with the drop-in camera here, brought focus away from the iconic city center and toward the dynamic neighborhoods of greater Chicago. So the project is called Cover the Grid, and it uses field painting, as we saw in some earlier work, to prototype and envision futures for underserved locations on Chicago's west side. Each urban painting engages civic boundaries, public rights of way, the Chicago grid, and neighborhood infrastructure. And as with our project in Ragdale, the installation produces a dynamic temporary civic space with no associated material waste or demolition cost. So the project transforms territory into landscapes for civic gathering through modest acts of painting and superimposing new programs, remapping existing urban boundaries, and revealing civic potential. So our site was Bell Park, a thriving community hub at the intersection of 3 critical links, operating at the scale of city, neighborhood, and block. So you can see us in the center there. And so for the last 30 years, this surface that we worked on, this asphalt lot, has been an essential gathering hub for neighborhood residents and organizations. It's not like we came in as architects and made space. There was already space there. And from experience, we knew that the softscape field paintings lasted a few weeks, but on asphalt or concrete, they'd last significantly longer, dramatically shifting the timescale of this project. So literally and figuratively, what kind of mark would we leave on the neighborhood and for how long was a major question. How could we best facilitate many possible futures and not try to prescribe one? And each of these questions were provoked by David Brown, who sought not formal solutions, but generative and transitional acts of architecture for the park. So our site acts as a billboard toward the elevated pink line, attracting passersby with a sudden burst of color and graphics. So this is the last thing you see moments before the train stops. And Cover the Grid is based on calibration patterns and color charts. And these are, what interests us about these is that these are all the tools that a photographer uses before anything happens. It's like the site is preparing for action. The installation is temporary and serves as a prototype to the community to test and manipulate the space. So the work plans its own obsolescence. It fades away as the planning for the site's permanent future intensifies, which we'll mention at the end here. And we entered this site with a unique and dynamic history, and we're not the beginning or the concluding act. We're a modest bridge into the future. And it was really important for us to understand our role and that the work reflected that in its organization and in its graphics and its aesthetics. So in the parlance of the lecture, the timeful work here exists in a kind of third space and time, right? It's not what it was, and it's not what it's going to be. It's a bridge. There were long-term plans for resealing the lot. So in the meantime, this temporary graphic was a kind of graphic test bed. It was a design that was developed in collaboration with many protagonists. Another essential part of this happening, David had relationships on the ground with many community organizations. We worked with Jermaine Barnes and Shaheen Rudbari with Moss Context. The community partners included Under the Grid, Freedom House Studios, and the West Side Association for Community Action, all of these based in North Lawndale. Some literally across the street. And our design process included workshops with local design camp students to understand their desires for the place. Their desires were color, 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 and a three-point line. The game had changed since this court had been drawn. Three-point line is very, very important to younger kids. So results from these workshops helped program the graphic test bed, which integrated an existing basketball court that was there, again, without a three-point line. And then Foursquare, hopscotch, crosswalk through the site, and other informal gathering spaces for spectators. And unlike Ragdale, this site required weaving our clumsy little robot through a lot of complex infrastructure. But we worked, as Ashley mentioned, to maximize the time and space people had on the park. So this is a pickup game that's happening kind of moments after the painting. And then there were weekly block parties on the site. So this crosswalk pattern, which actually allows people to cross their way through the lot, it formalizes an informal path that a lot of people use to get from this side of the neighborhood and into an area with a school, became a great place to do some line dancing. You can see moments where there's like overlap in activities happening on this kind of frenetic pattern. And one thing that was interesting for us, that is something that's inspired some new work that's still kind of coming on board, is that the effects are not only visual of this pattern. So the heat islands, which we saw a really nice sign outside actually acknowledging the effect of heat islands, have dramatic environmental and public health consequences for our cities. And in our analysis of North Lawndale, we found, not surprisingly, that there were disproportionate urban heat island effects, often characterized under-resourced communities. So this is a post-occupancy thermal analysis of Cover the Grid, which actually revealed a 14-degree difference between the coolest and warmest surfaces. So we're looking forward to exploring the atmospheric and environmental consequences of these urban paintings. And I mean, if you look at it in a kind of simple way, yes, like white is more reflective, and then we would have a kind of cooler surface, but also it's nice to have darker surfaces in the winter when you need things to be warm. So it's more about kind of creating a lot of different possibilities, and we're interested in what that's going to push in the work. So as I kind of close to this section, a few weeks ago, we had the pleasure of returning to North Lawndale for a workshop hosted by Joseph Altshuler and the Chicago Sukkah Festival. And while we were taking part in that event, we came to Bell Park, and we met with some of our previous collaborators. And we discovered, to our delight, that our painting is gone. As planned, this was always promised, the lot has been resurfaced. The basketball court remains, but in a new orientation that's less dangerous. And there are small flourishes of the iconic pink and green from our painting, but that's kind of it. It's completely kind of gone. So it's only on Google Earth, and it's going to disappear very shortly. It's now kind of just this memory that is really interesting to think about as we got so excited about what the park is now, which is quite beautiful.
So the next section of the work is what was promised in the intro, right? So we're interested. I think I lost. Okay, we're good. So we're reconsidering in our practice the future of American housing and what we call after the single-family house. What comes next? This is an experiment in creating intergenerational spaces and creating architecture with affordance and mutability for this uncertain future. So no two terms have been as influential in the development of the American suburb as the terms single and family. So these two words, which are core to our conceptions of housing forms in America, are determined by legal definitions and zoning codes in ways which no longer reflect our conceptions of kinship. So legal and zoning definitions promote the single-family home as an economic instrument, prioritizing home equity over social equity, collective access, or even individual desires. And there was a whole Supreme Court case actually about single-family zoning that I encourage you to look up, or it's noted in my text here. But to put this in another way, how many times has someone renovated their home not for their own enjoyment, but instead anticipating an improved resale value at some undisclosed date in the future, kind of assuming what some undisclosed buyer would prefer, right? So we see our homes as financial instruments primarily in the US. And using this tool of the home as a financial instrument to create generational wealth is actually quite particular to America. It's not the kind of global standard. And this has been protected by political leaders and financial institutions since the 1930s through mortgage and tax incentives, policies that have historically marginalized and discriminated based on race or gender. So this research, published in Mass Context 33, Vigilantism, is the foundation for several upcoming residential building projects which are designed by Outpost Office, which considered timefulness as it relates to the American home. A longhouse, the first of those which I'll show, is a proposal for a speculative proposal for collective housing that offers alternatives to the ideas of single and family. So the political preservation of the American single-family home hinders and stifles the imagination of alternatives. So this project endorses recent efforts to reevaluate the hegemony of the single-family home in America with a concrete architectural proposal for attached and semi-attached housing that sidesteps assumptions of inhabitants' lifestyles and kinship structures. So the project is not a single discrete building. It is a flexible prototype to densify suburban and exurban locales. So a longhouse crumpled form can adapt to the enigmatic demands of various sites. So on the left, possible unit configurations, if the plan remains the same, can change over time. And on the right, you see maybe leftover sites of strange shapes that might exist in a city, and Longhouse could infill those to increase density in a neighborhood. So the geometry destabilizes normative notions of boundary. It offers semi-detached living spaces, flexible surplus spaces, and communal porches. Variable unit sizes, as shown in the previous diagram, make it ideal for multi-generational housing. The numbers of members of a kinship group could be flexible over time, again, which reflects the reality of families. A longhouse offers a collection of semi-detached ground floor units organized by modules for storage and service. So this alternating pattern of open and closed spaces provides flexibility in the framework for delineating dwelling units of variable size, programs, or profiles. The service cabinets ensure that the exterior massing does not reflect the interior configuration, defying conventional registration of ownership and separation that characterizes modern attached housing or single-family homes. In the upper level, that amplifies spatial entanglement and connections between units with large open spaces for shared resources like home offices or childcare spaces. The dominant architectural gesture of a longhouse is its continuous undulating roof. The roof houses the aforementioned shared spaces above the generous porches. The exaggerated gable provides pragmatic shelter, but predominantly serves for this unifying image of a longhouse, drawing together the entire complex and ensuring the community lives literally and figuratively under one roof. For a recent exhibition, we built 2 large prototype models of longhouse. Each model is a flat-packed, ready-to-assemble kit for easy transportation and rapid assembly. The models comprise ubiquitous low-grade residential construction materials like OSB and aluminum struts, things that the house might actually be constructed out of, and an applied graphic of fluorescent high-vis yellow accents on the model kind of contrasts the muted and subdued palette of grays, tans, and beiges of the OSB. So this long elevation reveals the inherent tension between the collective gesture of the iconic imagery of the single-family home. The project was first commissioned for the Wedge Gallery in Los Angeles, but both models we actually prefer here appeared in several vacant commercial storefronts in Columbus, Ohio. So these micro exhibitions transformed speculative holdings into venues for domestic exploration, draw attention away to dormant commercial spaces in a Midwest jurisdiction offering little affordable houses. So put more simply, we staged these in empty storefronts as Columbus during the 2020 and 2021 kind of overbuilt commercial space, but had a lack of affordable housing, which is seen in many cities around the US. All of the empty buildings are commercial and office, and housing doesn't exist in some neighborhoods. So liberated from the gallery, the models appear strangely at home on display. They're here amongst the debris and detritus of unceasing development. So in 2021, our exhibition also shifted to online delivery. So we used that as an opportunity to explore alternative forms of engagement with a longhouse, again, wondering how we could use this to expand the audiences for architecture geographically. So we used our shipping and installation budget, which didn't ship to California, to commission the development of an app with our collaborator, Oliver Popovich. So the app, which works on phones or laptops or any other devices, I encourage you to play around with it. It allows users to crumple up their own log houses. So it's a very silly little app, and it activates and distributes the production of longhouse prototypes. Since there's no authoritative longhouse drawing, every version of longhouse is still valid. They are all still longhouses, as we call them. So we encourage you to make your own, send them to us. We love to see people who try to kind of push the software to its edge and almost kind of break what the algorithm can do.
The broken ones are kind of best.
And the broken ones are great, and so here you kind of click, 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 say fold it, and then a longhouse will appear. So you don't kind of know exactly what you're doing until you get to the end, and then you realize the things that worked, the things that didn't work, the mistakes you've made, and you kind of come back for more. But again, there you're making a longhouse in about 20 or 30 seconds. So again, just trying to kind of think about proliferation over specificity and kind of individualism. We're looking much more at that kind of collective production of housing. So timefulness in architecture related to housing, it's not only spatial, social, and material, but it's also financial as well, which is something we've been working on with one and a half house. A house that is a little bit too small and also a little bit too big. Thus, we call it 1.5. But it's a trust model that makes residents past and present its beneficiaries. So caretakers of the homes, you might call them renters, we call them caretakers, would receive passive income based on appreciation. So a modest correction, again, to predatory market instruments that have often discriminated based on race, marital status, or gender. So it's situated on a corner lot in a dense single-family neighborhood. The houses massing there subtly breaks the otherwise monotonous rhythm of the neighborhood. So the lot itself is also a bit of a misfit. It's half the depth of a standard lot, which makes packing 2 units in a spatial challenge. But here we are kind of exploiting actually the existing zoning codes, which allows for a duplex even on this tiny lot, which they probably won't want, right? So again, it's a little bit larger than a single family home. It's a little bit smaller than a duplex, and it's on a lot that's half the size. So if you do the math, then you get 1.5, right? So the house allows for 4 distinct configurations, dismantling the enduring and problematic idea of kinship permanence. The flexible design alters with changes to family composition, work-life relationships, or financial situation. So more than functional flexibility, these adaptive and contingent spatial arrangements sustain the house over time. The configurations of the house include a traditional duplex, a single continuous building, the most traditional of the two, but it also could be arranged as a single apartment with an attached office or a residence with an attached extended family unit. We also hope, as in the Kharkiv project, that the house begins to transform into possibilities that we never anticipated after several years of use. We've been using our robot also to prototype and iterate on the plan at 1-to-1 scale. We're excited that this house will begin construction next year in 2024. And as a self-developed project, we'll be able to work outside the traditional client-architect relationship to assume the financial risk and provide models of innovative design without financial exploitation. And we think a lot about working outside of this client-architect relationship because often those relationships and those financial models kind of don't always encourage the type of thinking that we want to do about what comes after the single family, because the single family, again, is so kind of ingrained in our existing financial system.
So as we've shared this afternoon, our work presumes that architecture might last for a day or a year, perhaps centuries, but we should not discriminate based on its duration. And a timeful architecture doesn't prescribe a form or a process, but it calls for work that's responsive to polytemporal demands. Timeful architecture works across multiple timescales simultaneously and includes the unfinished, the seasonal, the temporary, and the adaptive. And timeful architecture is always provisional, open-ended, and contingent. And we suspect timefulness might allow us to assert renewed relevance in our architecture. In our own work and experiments, this approach leaves us increasingly indifferent to simplistic notions of resolution or finality. Our ambition is for work at all physical levels that acknowledges the manifold timescales of architecture, leveraging how a project unfolds in time, but doing that towards new architectural effects. So thank you to everyone for joining this afternoon.
Yeah, so we're happy to take questions if there are.
Have you actually had the opportunity? We went to record it and with the people. Yeah, that's it.
We can leave this on.
It's
At this point, all models. I think we have to start with 1.5 house. We're going to start small. We're going to do 1.5 house before we move up to the kind of bigger scale of long house. But I think that's definitely a direction that we want to go in the future. We're going to kind of test it by moving up in scale.
And do you envision that as just traditional stick framing, or is that going to be more of a modular system?
Yeah, I think we designed it, or we originally considered it stick framing. I think also looking at the design now, even just in the past 2 years, so much more CLT is being built in residential construction. I could definitely see that design working quite well with CLT. So I think if it did become a realized construction challenge, I think that might be something that we would look at as well. Yeah, you want to build it for us?
It's very intriguing. I think it'd be super useful for some of the lots that I've seen out there. And just, I was already thinking of how you play with the roofs. That'd be a fun project.
Yeah.
Let's talk.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Honestly, we haven't, one thing we have talked about doing is, so we were experimenting with drawing the floor plan at 1-to-1 scale. That was just for ourselves. We thought it would be fun, but we actually learned a lot about the sizes of different rooms and things we wanted to change about it. But one thing we've also talked about is doing that on the site before construction starts. Because I think, yeah, in a neighborhood like you're saying, there's one day there's an empty lot, and the next day there's starting construction, and as a neighbor, sometimes you feel like, hey, nobody told me, but and nobody's really required to tell. But I think there's a kind of nice gesture there of just the kind of communication and dialogue between neighbors, right? When that construction is started, so that people feel like they kind of understand and know what's coming, to expect, what kinds of changes to the neighborhood and things like that. So, I mean, I think that would be one way we'd be interested in that.
Yeah, I like the idea of having like an open house, right? But just like drawing the drawing. I mean, I think what's really great about that technique too is that like we're amongst architecture students and architects here, and we can like generally, I would hope, read a plan, right? But something magical happens when you put it at 1-to-1 on the ground, right? And suddenly our expertise with our facility with scale and our facility to project, those things aren't needed, right? You can literally walk on it. And I think that whether it becomes something we do in the 1.5 house, I think one thing we're really invested in is figuring out how to use this type of prototyping longer term with projects, and there is this question about like, a balance between engagement, right? Which, like community engagement can, like, it has different valences, and our friend Jeanette Kim does marvelous work on this, versus like collective power where people actually have agency, right? And just by producing the drawing on the ground, that doesn't give everyone agency, but it does make things more accessible, and there is more of a possibility. Another thing that's kind of fascinating about this is that when we came to the neighborhood, we talked with a lot of colleagues who work in Chicago, including our friends at Future Firm. And we were speaking with Anne Louis, and we said, what are common mistakes people make working in throughout Chicago in these neighborhoods? Like, what is the biggest mistakes you can make? And she said, people overpromise, and they show renderings that are completely unrealistic. And so what was great for us is that our representations, our renderings, were just the drawings on the ground. That was the only promise we were making. And I think that there was something really fantastic about that and so rewarding. But we would like to see them participate then in longer term projects, right? Where a 1.5 house has effects that will unfold over a much longer amount of time. So thank you for the question.
Which technique in particular? Oh yeah. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the thing that we've learned about this is it's very scalable. Like it's a very scalable technique actually, because, well, in some ways you're working at 1-to-1, but it's also scalable in that we can make very small drawings, we can make very large drawings, both at kind of 1-to-1 scale, right? I think in the for the longhouse, which is multifamily, the plan that we showed where it's the same plan, but maybe the units are broken down in different configurations over time. So the exterior of the house wouldn't change, but the interior partitions might change. I think using something like the robot to kind of, again, play that out with people as they're kind of choosing their unit, and thinking about size and also relationship to, again, maybe an extended family member or a friend or something that's living in the neighboring unit. I think that could be, again, really useful tools for engaging with people who are not architects, but potentially residents. Yeah. Well, I would say for the first question about this project, about our, I think you're right. Like it did change our understanding of time, and I think memory was a big part of that. So this lot, depending on how old you are in the neighborhood, depends on what you call the court, how you refer to it. So older people refer to it as Bell Park, because there was like an AT&T building right beside it, which used to be Bell, right? We call it Bell. And then younger residents call it Waka Court, because the West Side Association for Community Action, WACA, is the one who hosts most events there. So even depending, older people were like, well, to me it's Bell Park, and the younger kids are like, I don't know what that means, So even again, because, and we loved that about the site. It was so much us learning about the history of that site, the history of the neighborhood, how important it was. And that was just a huge takeaway from day one, which is they absolutely love this site. So that's also very challenging. It's easy if a client comes and says, our building is terrible, fix it, and it's harder when they say, this space is really special to us, fix it. But they didn't say fix it, and so there was no kind of fix it. So again, I think we were always just really interested in, what can we do now? How can we be in the present moment? Also, because we had a design team, and some of the, and we would ask for suggestions on what to paint, and some people wanted to kind of actually paint some things that related to the history of the neighborhood, which we thought might be interesting. And then we presented that to the neighborhood, and they were much more interested in it being very contemporary. They said, we really want it to reflect what we like right now. And what the kids were liking right now was they were watching Saved by the Bell reruns, and they were like, and so they were like, we like these 80s graphics. And I was like, oh, well, so do I, but I was born in the 80s. So, so there was a very nice kind of, we got along on graphics a lot, but that was very interesting too, is that there's a lot of nostalgia, but also they were really interested in it looking fresh and contemporary and hip, whatever that means. This back on. There we go. Anything else you want to add about that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question about informality versus formality, right? And maybe that gets back to the question about affordance. Like, I think we tend to appreciate architecture that has at its root like a lot of kind of generic relationships that then allow for flexibility. And so like there were a lot of murals in the neighborhood, but this was like the first more horizontal one. And the best guidance came from looking and analyzing sports fields, actually, right? You think about like a football field, quite actually a generic set of things, but because of the protocols that are introduced, very informal and wild things happen on football fields. So I think that we really liked the idea of using also patterns that felt not so authored. So like a gradient is something that's a kind of graphic system. It has a kind of a tradition. And so we were looking for reverberations between the activities that they wanted to use and things that we could almost pull off the shelf, right? Again, to say that like, it's almost like you're watching TV and this is like broadcasting a kind of test pattern that's just there temporarily so that people can kind of learn or speculate on new ways to use the space. But I do think that in our work then, I think there is a focus on formality in design, but informality in activity and the tension between those versus like filling this with a kind of like playful mural that has informal aesthetic characteristics, but may not invite informal activity. So that tension for us, I'm just glad you mentioned it because it's such a kind of like, it's such an important tension for us to kind of understand. But you had a second question as well, if you could, you remember it? Oh, so, I mean, yeah. So Ashley's haunted by this. I would say that one thing is that there's limits to our expertise, and I would say that like people like Dana Cuff and her work set up like the ADU, helped set up the ADU program that we're now seeing kind of nationwide. And so Ashley can allude to this though, and this is the question.
Give me this. This literally keeps me up at night. No, hold on. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So I mean, in doing this research about this, I did not actually realize that. Single family zoning was not really a thing until the 1920s, and then it was taken all the way to the Supreme Court. So there was a Supreme Court ruling, 1924, something like this, that said you actually can exclude buildings in a neighborhood that are not single family because there was a belief or an understanding at the time that only single family homes would be financially more valuable, right? It was just a given assumption that a single family home is more financially valuable than duplex or multifamily, et cetera. So I'm not the person to change a Supreme Court ruling, but I think there are lots of creative workarounds right at the moment, right? So there are things like ADUs. You know, our creative workaround here is finding the smallest lot we could that was already kind of grandfathered in for a duplex, right? So we can do a duplex on it. The issues there are parking, and I've already contacted Columbus, Ohio. Yeah, I've already filled out a little survey about how I think the number of parking spaces they require are too many, especially given how we should be, thinking about mobility in the future and sustainability and things like that. So I think there are these little things that actually, I talk about the Supreme Court ruling, but actually most of the great work there happens locally. And if a few cities kind of pilot these different programs, whether it's the ADUs in California, which again are problematic in many other ways, but they are a good start in just loosening up people's thinking about what a single family home is and what is the value of the home. Is it strictly only monetary? I don't think people actually think about their homes as only monetary, but when it comes to making decisions about their homes, the way they look, the materials they use, the way the financial systems, monetary value kind of dominates everything. And I understand why, but I think the local level we can do some of this. I think we kind of have to prove it as a concept sometimes as architects, which is great and also unfortunate. But I think if we work on kind of proving a few of these models, again, it's like CLT or something. It was not that common to be building homes out of CLT even just 5 or 10 years ago in the U.S., but now it's more common, and that is actually pushing on fire codes, to push back and say, actually, we can have things that work here. So I think it's going to be slow. It's going to be incremental, but it's important.
And I think the incremental piloting is important. And I don't suggest ADUs as a solution, but the reason I bring that up is when Dana Cuff and others were trying to pilot that, it wasn't just an effort to change planning, it was also, there were design proposals on hand that inspired this thinking. And so I think that, like, we are not all the expertise that's needed, but architects play a role in this. And so I would say that that's a great model, right? Where architects might say, well, you know, I don't have agency here because I'm not an expert on this kind of legislation, or this, you know, it's the Supreme Court or whatever. And I think that the work that they did, the work that group did, linking design and policy together, is a great kind of pilot and understanding how change can be facilitated.
So you can call out. Yes, yeah.
It is, I mean, home buying, home owning, and families buying their home kind of thing is like, might be as almost universal, but kind of like saying like a single family home, different than this kind of an apartment or whatever, is like, is a very, very American concept. So, what I'm curious about, and you kind of mentioned the monetary value when you make that decision about how like single family home is more than your home, is actually you kind of make a decision based on the money kind of thing. So what I wonder is it like a little bit like more, and you said you were kind of working on this project without a client and trying to make this idea to push forward. So is this really kind of leading to some kind of like creating an environment that is desirable, but desire that is detached from monetary value? Like it's not going to be able to be sold ever? You want to, yeah, your mind?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we are both operating within the system and trying to push on the system. I think that's the most important thing, is that, you know, if we want this to be a real project, we will have to get our zoning permissions, and we will have to get our building permits and things like that. So, so we understand the kind of real constraints and, you know, where we're currently not allowed to push on things and where we are. I think our idea for the 1.5 house is that, you know, it will be, in a sense, we will be the developer, although that term comes with lots of things we're trying to avoid, but there's, that is the term, right? So we would be the kind of owners, but again, it would be something, we're looking at different financial models, like cooperatives have one kind of buy-in financial model. There are, you know, other types of co-living arrangements, which are already like within our legal system that you can utilize. We're looking at kind of combining aspects that we like from these different financial models. It still operates as property. It still is able to be bought and sold. It's more actually the kind of idea of renting that we were interested in tackling with this. So looking at shifts in generation that have to do with the changing nature of the American family or our conceptions of kinship. We've also looked at, you know, this kind of delaying of, you know, even our generation and younger, this sort of delaying of this act of buying a house, right? And while we are critical of, you know, this idea that everybody has to own a house, for several generations prior, it was a way of building lots of wealth, which again may be problematic, but it did kind of create wealth for families. With renting longer and longer into adulthood, people are struggling then to kind of save equity. And so the idea here is that, you know, renters are caretakers and they are paying rent, but a portion of that is also coming back to them later in life. So it's more this kind of just kind of simple acknowledgement of buying a home is not great for everyone at every life stage. It's not the desirable thing because people want to move, people are still changing the size of their family. But at the same time, renting can be very predatory. Rents seem to only ever go up, and can be really out of reach for some people. So we're trying to more kind of tackle that short term, and think less about that long term.
However, I think we've talked mainly about the detached single-family house, at least in this conversation, primarily as something that's been legislated, adjudicated, and in many ways kind of controlled by the real estate market and the banking industry. But I think we have to acknowledge, outside of this friendly audience, it is really, really ingrained in American culture. And
Yeah.
in fact, I think it's
Yeah.
maybe, I've spent a lot of time overseas, and it might be like a one thing I know for sure
Yeah.
that's so
Yeah.
uniquely American.
Yes. Yeah.
If we were in another country as American architects and saying, oh, you shouldn't live in that, you should live in one of these, you would think like, why is this architect proposing that? Like, this is this country. So in some ways I might ask the question, because I've asked it myself, I mean, are we swimming upstream? It's like, should we find, should we just accept it, right? And
Yeah.
I think Japan may be one of the other places in the world that has wood frame detached houses pretty predominantly in rural landscapes. We just don't.
Yeah.
I can't even imagine what it takes to get, if my father was to live in the 80s, but it's like, what would it take for him to own a multi-family building? I don't, or ride a bus. Like, he just
Yeah.
doesn't do it. So I think this is more,
It's a cultural shift.
I think legislation, Supreme Court rulings for election are a really unique culture that goes way back to Thomas Jefferson. It goes back to the Continental Grid that we live in Columbus. It goes back to the yeoman farmers that came, that were some of the first colonialists. So I guess for me, when I hear about legislation, that's like we can change that.
Yeah.
Still, even in affordable housing, sometimes you can't get people to move in it, even when it's cleaner, healthier, and more affordable. They will stay in lesser housing than detached housing.
I'm gonna be honest too. I'm gonna be honest. We live in a single-family home as well because there are no other options in Columbia. So our compromise has been our single-family home is in a historic neighborhood. So the next home is 4 feet from ours. We have like a 4-foot alley, between ours and the next. So for us, that's at least like a little bit different. But exactly. Yeah, perfect. So you're kind of little commune. You've got your own commune, and no. And so, to be just very clear, this is not a criticism of anyone's, choice. I think we're very. I see a desire for people. I see many people who are not architects who actually want to live differently, especially when they're younger. And I have a feeling that if people do it in their 30s and 40s. Coming back to it when they're 60 or 70, maybe when they're empty nesters or something, I think that's really a possible cultural shift that we could very easily see. They may not want to do it for their entire lives, but again, we're looking at models of flexibility, so you might do it in a few parts of your life, a few stages of your life. So I think, I think we're interested in just providing people more options because America is so dominated by this one very specific imagination of how we should live. And for me, growing up, it just always seemed like it didn't fit me. And I thought if it didn't fit me, there must be many, many more people it didn't fit.
I appreciate this conversation because I think that there is a certain kind of suspension of reality that happens within certain types of architectural speculation. But one thing I would say also about the longhouse is that it's it's kind of an in-between model, right? It's not very high, right? And it still has a lot of characteristics of the type of homes you would expect. And then there is still a kind of lawn, and then there's like a porch, but it's shared. There's an attic, but it's shared. Like, what if the attic became something that you could actually use instead of full of stuff? So it's I wouldn't say it's a perfect solution because that's not its purpose as a projection. But I think you're totally right in the fact that it reminds me of the work of like Keith Crumweddy, where like so much of this is a potency of myth and narrative, right? And desire that's just baked in so much you can't even imagine overcoming it. And I think that that's where the Longhouse is trying to fill a gap with saying maybe these like denser and even more efficient multifamily housings might be outside the like, imagination, but what's the in between? What is that kind of thing that's like one step away? Because it is, you know, in that way it's quite conservative, and it's yeah. Well, that's the other part of this, right? It's like we've relied on a kind of imbalance that maybe won't be, you know, supporting the way we've been living.
Yeah, I think even the American Yard, we are beginning to see, you know, major newspapers are starting to publish articles that are like, hey, maybe the grass yard is not going to work for us in the future. So I think that kind of idea, I don't see a lot of yards changing over, but you see a lot of conversation about it. And in wildfire-prone areas, you're seeing more and more kind of other types of landscaping being used. So if we can crack away at the lawn, I think, I think we can do other things. Yeah.
I was actually kind of moving a question that I was not planning to ask, but almost from the opposite direction, like asking, why doesn't it go higher? Why doesn't it really
Yeah.
challenge the single-family home? And I think I just throw it to the conversation. And I think this is almost as much a response to Tim as to the lecture, which I think was fascinating and very rich. It's about, I mean, we guys talked about so many different things that were, you know, spot on the stuff that we're doing in studios and talking in studios. So I love it. We're gonna talk more about that. But regarding the housing question, I totally agree that change is gonna happen. Also, culture change, right? And I totally agree, and I love that you guys are doing these kind of experiments. That architecture has something to say to that discussion, bringing visions. Sometimes visions that are connecting and emerging from what already is there. Sometimes visions that are more disruptive. Right? But I think that the acknowledgement that the U.S. and American culture is also so open and diverse. There's actually people living in apartments now, and they live in apartments. They have families in apartments. They have kids in apartments. So I think there's a lot of complexity also related to questions of race and class and so on. That I really think that these kind of projects are relevant. We should be doing more of those. And I would love that you guys, with your skills and your talents, would go into a 10 and a half house, something like that.
Yeah.
So we could start seeing how this
Yeah.
this, but keeping the quality, which is the challenge.
Yeah.
The qualities of domestic spaces and so on. Beautiful. I also love your work with bidimensional kind of organizations. Many times installations, architects installations, like that, seem almost like an excuse to do affordable work. But in your case, I think this idea, especially the concept of Timeful and how you guys explain it, is so embraces it so well. It makes it, I mean, presents it so clearly. So I really love it. It was a beautiful. We will talk more.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
No.
The last thing I was going to say about these projects, though, you also mentioned a lot about like the type of the paint that you use. It's biodegradable.
Yeah.
Biodegradable.
Yes.
And that in a week or two with rain and everything is gonna just like paint away. And the housing projects, of course they're in the idea level or something, but about the fact that this whole notion of where everything is so much changing, how much we really build something permanent kind of idea. Maybe something about not only changing the idea of the house and building that permanently, but there's something still in that house as well that actually is like biodegradable. It's actually
Yeah.
material-wise.
Yeah.
Something is not as you design as it was.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be break. It's supposed to demolish or something where
Yeah.
what you thought is supposed to be like two rooms is becoming one big because
Yeah. That's a great idea. We're going to take that idea. Yeah.
After we talk to the stick frame guy, we'll get
Yeah,
this,
yeah.
get this all worked out. No, but I think that's exactly it, because the timefulness it's about performance over different durations, and I think that's exactly right. So how much of this can we? Okay, if it needs to last, which we want it to, right? Then it needs to be watertight, right? And it needs to protect. But other things can start to fall away in terms of what we would need. So I think that's a great way to think about how, as this project becomes more material, right, how would we drive this idea through with some consistency? And that's also goes hand in hand with the genericism of the plan, which hopefully you would be able to kind of completely use it in a way that's unexpected. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Oh, hey, Asa. This is our plant, so. Yeah.
Of course he is.
No, thank you for that, Asa. I mean, it's been really transformative to the practice. And I think that we, from the start, especially as a kind of young, more paper practice, like we're always interested in drawings, but the machine has changed our relationship to drawings in a lot of different ways. The first thing is that when we decided to do the paintings as a technique, we actually thought, okay, we're going to build the machine because we want like...
Erik thought we
Okay, Erik, yeah, I thought we'd just build the machine because, come on. And so we did some research, and Ashley encouraged me to do some research, and we found a series of geodetic scientists at Carnegie Mellon who were like PhD level students who spent like 5 years working on one, and it was fine, but it didn't, this thing, there it is, okay. But it wasn't great. And then I realized, okay, I had I wasn't so egotistical to think I couldn't outdo 5 PhD students. So we decided we need to go off the shelf. So we contacted this company, Turf Tank. And what's interesting about working with this thing off the shelf is that it's designed only to do a few very, very specific things. Just like the robot arms in our labs are designed actually to really do one task over and over and over. And it's only in architecture schools that they do all this kind of different stuff. So one thing about the robot, for example, is that it's right-handed. So the painting arm is on one side, so it can spin theoretically with like 0 radius one way, but like 3 feet the other. So if you have a chicane of curves, you can't draw it continuously. You have to break that down. And then with the temporariness, even thinking about things like you don't want it to drive over a line it just drew because it smears it. So like all of a sudden, thinking about the drawing not as a kind of pattern or as a kind of projection, but as a process, as a set of instructions, I think that's what's changed actually the work the most. And I think you see that a little bit in the DNA of the Longhouse, where actually the Longhouse it's really, like there are drawings of it. There's like this drawing, right? But this is the drawing of Longhouse, right? Where the drawing is a kind of performance and there's a set of relationships that we're interested in working with. So I think that's been the biggest change, is it's just changed our sensitivity to drawing as a kind of active performance. And we've gotten much more sensitive, as you would expect, to learning how to make instructions. Everything becomes like a soloist. Everything becomes a way of like being explicit about things, but also leaving them open enough to change as we go on different sites. Thank you all so much for coming.